Japan's housing market is broken because it's affordable. In almost every other country, having cheap rent while being developed seems to be impossible to coexist. Why is Japan the exception? In this video, I'm going to break down the history, the politics, and the financial logic that ties everything together. The rent in Tokyo is around $750 a month. If you want a bigger place or closer to the center, it might cost you about $1,000. To understand why it's so cheap, we have to go back to the peak of Japan's economy. December 29, 1989, when the Nikkei index finished its all-time high. At the time, people partied every night. Bosses took their employees to host bars to drink expensive champagnes and play games, smoking cigars with beautiful women as a daily ritual. And everyone believed the Japanese economic miracle that 20 years of 9% GDP growth every year will undoubtedly continue. So naturally, when certain signals started to show up, such as delayed mortgage payments and uncommon market behaviors, most people just thought this is just another little dip before we break the record again. Yet, on the contrary, it was the beginning to the end. Over the next 4 years, the stock market shrank by 75%, the housing market more than 80%. Prices in Ginza, the heart of Tokyo, dropped by over 90%. Abe Hiroshi, a national treasure of an actor of Japan, bought his first luxury apartment as a young model for 62 million yen in 1987. Part of it was from his own savings, most of it was a loan. It was a smart move on paper at the time because property value skyrocketed soon after. Feeling like an investing genius, as most did, he bought 5 more properties stacking over 300 million yen in debt by 1989. Few days later, he turned 26. Then the crash came. Property values vanished, debt stayed. He lost his job as a model almost instantly because when businesses die, most modeling agencies whose job is to promote those businesses die around the same time. But somehow, Hiroshi managed to pivot. He became an actor. Later, he had a killer career, made millions and millions, became one of the highest paid celebrities in the country, and finally cleared his debt by 2007. It took the wealthiest actor over 15 years to unslave himself. Most people were not that lucky. Some are still paying off the debt even to today. Some declared bankruptcies, which in Japanese culture is considered to be worse than death. Some chose death. In the infamous Aokigahara Forest, the place where Logan Paul once made a name of himself. Most Japanese people only started to recognize the economic downturn after 1994, which as time went on became the lost decade, then 2, and now 3. If you grew up watching Japanese anime, reading Japanese manga like I did, you probably have heard the stereotypes too that Japan is not only known for its entertainments, but also famous for its high self-life-taking rates and how many working-age adults stay isolated in their own rooms for years and years without ever coming out. In my opinion, it was not their culture to blame, at least not entirely. It was mostly due to their economy. If you compare the unemployment rates and self-life-taking rates from 1990 to 2010, the similarity is painfully obvious. When people stop making money, lost their jobs and hope, they stay inside of their rooms, stop having sex, and sometimes unalive themselves, which nowadays is less and less of a Japanese phenomenon, but more and more a Western phenomenon. Today, Japan's demographics is still in great decline, but it seems they have finally suffered through the toughest part. Japanese people today are 99% guaranteed a decent job the moment they leave school, because there are finally more jobs existing than people. Let's break down how the bubble was born and bursted. we have to start with an unpopular opinion of mine. That is, the Plaza Accord did not crush Japan's economy. The 1984 Plaza Accord was a deal where the US and 4 other nations, Japan included, agreed to weaken the US dollars altogether. The US proposed the deal because it was struggling badly. 2 oil crises almost tripled the gas price. At the same time, Americans fell in love with the made-in-Japan products, cars, electronics, everything, simply for their lower prices and better qualities. So of course the American companies and unions were not very happy about it. They were bleeding cash, employment was down, America was in a proper recession. Washington tried to trade war their way out of it, including tariffs and quotas. Didn't really work. Even with 100% tariffs added, Japanese products were still half the price, twice the quality. So America had to unite other countries, including Japan, to sell the US dollars altogether to weaken the US currency. When there are more dollars in the market, the dollar becomes cheap, therefore making the US products cheaper to the international consumers, thus helping the US economy to get out of a recession. But it would also make the Japanese yen more expensive, therefore it may cause a recession to happen in Japan. Japan agreed to the deal because back then over 40% of Japanese exports went straight to the United States of America. Had they said no, they could have lost their biggest customer. Fast forward to 2025. Will China sign a similar deal with the United States of America? I don't know, but I don't think so. America is China's biggest customer, but only 14% instead of 40%. And as for the question, should we bend our knees to Trump to reach a deal does not even exist in China, at least not in the popular opinions. So if this is the game of who will bend their knees first, being a Chinese person, I'm telling you, I don't think that's gonna happen first with China. Back to Japan. The Plaza Accord pushed Japan into a minor recession as expected, but it was so minor that some experts today even refused to categorize it as a recession. And that's when the real mistake happened. The Japanese government got panicked. They didn't want the Japanese miracle to slow down, which it did for only a bit. So as a response, they slashed the interest rates from 5% to 2.5%. It was the right decision. If you cut your interest rate accordingly, you stimulate the economy and people make more money. The mistake was they didn't raise the interest rate back up right after the recession ended. As to why they didn't, some say it was the pressure from the US. Others say they were scared of a Japanese version of the Black Monday, which were partially caused by raising the interest rates. There's also a much darker theory that the Bank of Japan wanted more power and autonomy, so they let the bubble happen until it burst. And after that, they got exactly what they wanted: independence from the government. If you're interested in this theory, there's a documentary called The Princess of the Yen, which I will post the link in the description. The bubble was now set in motion. And Japan's economy for the next 4 years have completely lost its sanity. Every living adult was making so much money. In fact, the only way to lose money was if you didn't buy fast enough. Thus, you make less money. Thus, you lose money. That was the definition of losing money at the time. To show you how ridiculous everything got, between 1985 to 1991, Japan's housing prices tripled. And it was way worse in Tokyo. The price of Ginza was a heart-attacking amount of $220,000 US per square meter, which is around $500,000 in today's money. By the way, if you watch American films from the 80s, you will notice that all the rich Asians from those films were Japanese instead of Chinese. That part was historically accurate. When the housing market becomes a religion, the youth become sacrificed. Banks at the time were encouraged to lend as much as they could to the young people, fully aware it would take them decades to pay it back. That is, if they didn't lose their jobs, which, by the way, many of them later did. And that is when one of the most hated men in modern Japanese history enters the group chat. He was the vice governor of the Bank of Japan at the time, and he famously said something that, for once, actually made some sense. It's not normal for young people to work their whole lives and still never be able to afford a home. So he did what had to be done. After he became the governor of BOJ, he raised the interest rate to 6%, which immediately crashed the stock market. The housing market followed a year after. You shouldn't mess with young people's future with ridiculous housing prices. Unaffordable housing equals people can't afford to have families or children, equals no future for the country. Therefore, unaffordable housing equals no future for the country. Japan learned this the hard way, and that is why they have policies in places such as the short-term capital gains tax, up to 50% tax on properties that are purchased and sold within 5 years, which effectively stopped the flipping culture. The inheritance tax, up to 55% tax on expensive real estate when passing down generationally, a very effective way to tax the rich. The Vacant House Special Measures Act forces owners to maintain, use, pay additional taxes, or sell additional properties, which further stops people from flipping properties. The debt-to-income ratio regulation is a debt-to-income cap that limits how much of your income can go toward mortgage payments of no more than 35 to 40%. Japan's housing market is affordable because it was broken. Then they fixed it, or it fixed them. Policies like these, which prioritize stability over numbers, are exactly why Japan is now the second to third most trusted market in the world, right after the US and the EU. That is why when something happens to the American market or the European market, tons of money flows into the Japanese market. It is not the most profitable market, but it is the most safe, especially in times of great economic uncertainties, like a recession or perhaps even a Great Depression, which will be my topic for my next video.